Ilara treasured her backyard. It was a meticulously crafted sanctuary, a verdant haven carved out of suburbia's relentless sprawl. Every potted fern, every trailing vine, every perfectly placed paver stone spoke of hours of labor, of dreams, poured into tangible form. And at its heart, a shimmering azure rectangle, her pool. It wasn't Olympic-sized, nor did it boast waterfalls or elaborate grottos, but it was hers, a place of quiet contemplation, of sun-drenched afternoons lost, in a book, of cool, refreshing dips under a canopy of stars. For Ilara, the pool was more than just a body of water. It was an extension of her soul, a boundary marker for her peace. Her peace, however, had been under siege for the better part of 5 years, ever since Karen moved in next door. Karen, a woman who viewed the world as her personal buffet and boundaries, as suggestions, not rules. Her presence was a constant, low-frequency hum of discord. But it was Karen's son, Kevin, who truly amplified the static. Kevin, a perpetually sticky 11-year-old, embodied every entitled trait his mother actively encouraged. He was loud, demanding, and possessed a startling lack of self-awareness. Their houses were separated by a standard 6-foot wooden fence, sturdy enough, Ilara had thought, to offer a modicum of privacy. She'd been wrong. The fence was merely a suggestion to Kevin, who routinely launched footballs, frisbees, and occasionally himself over it. His high-pitched yelps and the constant thud of errant objects were the soundtrack to Ilara's afternoons, slowly chipping away at the tranquility she so desperately sought. She'd tried talking to Karen, of course. Gentle suggestions about retrieving toys, polite requests for lower noise levels during certain hours. Each attempt was met with a dismissive wave, a saccharine smile that didn't reach Karen's eyes, and invariably the infamous, "Oh, Ilara, kids will be kids. You're just so sensitive." The summer had been particularly brutal. A heat wave had settled over the city, turning everything into a shimmering inferno. Ilara found solace in her pool, emerging from its cool embrace only when hunger or exhaustion demanded. Her neighbors, however, seemed to view the heat as an invitation to intensify their outdoor activities. Kevin's makeshift baseball games now threatened her fragile rose bushes, and the incessant bounce of a basketball against the shared fence post hammered at her last nerve. Then came the Saturday that broke Ilara. She was floating on her inflatable lounger, eyes closed, listening to the gentle lapping of water against the pool's edge. The world felt momentarily right. Suddenly, a cacophony erupted from next door. Music blared, shrill whistles pierced the air, and dozens of voices coalesced into a roaring wave of sound. A party. Of course. Karen loved impromptu, unannounced gatherings. Ilara sighed, pulling, her towel over her face, bracing herself for the inevitable noise. But then, a voice cut through the din, amplified by what sounded like a megaphone or a particularly loud child's toy. It was Kevin. His voice, already piercing, now boomed across the neighborhood. "All right, everyone! The best pool party of the summer starts now! Everyone to my pool!" Ilara froze. Her eyes snapped open, a cold dread washing over her. Colder than the pool water she floated in. His pool? What on earth was he talking about? A moment later, a wave of laughter followed, and then the distinct sound of the latch on her back gate rattling. Ilara sat bolt upright, heart hammering against her ribs. The gate had been locked. It was always locked. But the sound wasn't stopping. It was growing more insistent. She watched in disbelief as the top of Kevin's head, followed by his beaming, audacious face, appeared over the fence near the gate. He was struggling with the latch, clearly attempting to open her gate. Behind him, a throng of children, at least a dozen, some with floaties, some clutching brightly colored towels, all stared expectantly at her pool. Kevin finally managed to jiggle the latch open. He pushed the gate inward with a triumphant flourish, revealing his grinning face, utterly devoid of any recognition that he was trespassing. "Come on, guys! Last one in is a rotten egg!" he yelled, turning back to the eager crowd. Before Alara could even process the sheer audacity, a stream of children, a tidal wave of young bodies surged through her gate. They were loud, boisterous, and completely oblivious. They ran across her manicured lawn, leaving muddy footprints, shedding towels and flip-flops as they went. One boy, no older than 9, immediately cannonballed into her pool, sending a wall of water over the side, drenching her carefully arranged petunias. Another girl, giggling hysterically, tried to climb onto Alara's lounger, mistaking it for a giant toy. Alara felt a scream rising in her throat, but it was trapped, choked by pure, unadulterated shock and fury. Her sanctuary, her private world had been utterly invaded. It was a violation so profound, so brazen, that it left her momentarily paralyzed. "Excuse me," Alara finally managed to choke out, her voice thin and reedy compared to the chaos. "What are you all doing here?" Kevin, already halfway in the pool, looked up, water dripping from his eyelashes. He squinted at her, a look of mild annoyance on his face. "We're swimming, duh," he said, as if she were the one stating the obvious. "It's my pool party. I invited everyone." "This is not your pool, Kevin," Alara retorted, finally finding some strength in her voice. "This is my pool. You are all trespassing. Get out." The children, momentarily startled by the adult voice of authority, paused their splashing. Some looked confused, others wary. But then Karen's voice boomed from the other side of the fence, sugary sweet but with an edge of steel. "Oh, Alara, relax. It's just a little fun. Kevin just wants to share his joy with his friends. You're being such a party pooper." Karen appeared at the gate, a broad, unsettling smile plastered on her face. She was holding a tray of brightly colored cupcakes. She didn't enter Alara's yard, but stood there, perfectly framed by the open gate, her gaze sweeping over the chaos in Alara's yard, as if it were a perfectly normal, even desirable scene. "See? They're having such a blast. Isn't it wonderful to see children happy?" "Happy children on my property, Karen!" Alara practically yelled, her hands clenched into fists. "They're destroying my yard. They're in my private pool. This is unacceptable," Karen tutted, her smile not wavering. "Honestly, Alara, it's just water. And a little grass. It'll grow back. You're always so dramatic. Kevin just thinks of it as a community pool. He's such a generous boy. Community pool." The words hung in the air, dripping with condescension and deliberate ignorance. Alara felt a tremor run through her. Karen wasn't just dismissing her, she was actively gaslighting her, rewriting reality to suit her own narrative. The invasion wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate act of entitlement sanctioned by the very person who should be teaching boundaries. "Get them out, Karen," Alara said, her voice low and dangerously steady. "Now, or I'm calling the police." Karen's smile finally slipped, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Oh, you wouldn't dare," she scoffed. "Imagine the scandal, calling the police on innocent children just having fun." But there was a hint of uncertainty in her eyes, a recognition that Alara wasn't backing down this time. Just then, Kevin, emboldened by his mother's presence, climbed out of the pool, dripping wet, and pointed an accusing finger at Alara. "Mom! She's being mean. She said it's not my pool." "It isn't your pool, Kevin," Alara snapped, her patience vaporizing. "It's mine. Get out." Karen stepped forward, finally entering Alara's yard, her expression hardening. "All right, Alara, that's enough. You're scaring the children. Kevin, darling, maybe we should just go back to our yard. This isn't worth the fuss." She winked at Alara, a knowing, triumphant gesture that twisted the knife. She wasn't removing them because she respected Alara's property. She was doing it because Alara was making a fuss, a term Karen used to dismiss any legitimate complaint. Slowly, Grudgingly, the children began to scramble out of the pool, grabbing their discarded towels. But as they left, many shot Ilara resentful glances. Kevin, before he walked through the gate, turned back, a defiant smirk on his face. "It is my pool," he muttered, just loud enough for Ilara to hear, before slamming the gate shut. The silence that descended was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of Karen's party continuing next door. Ilara stood amidst the wreckage of her backyard, muddy footprints staining her pavers, an overturned planter spilling soil onto the patio, and a distinct, lingering smell of chlorine mixed with cheap sunscreen and preteen boy. Her shoulders sagged. Her sanctuary was desecrated. Her peace was shattered. She looked at her beautiful pool, now a murky expanse, its calm surface disturbed by the residue of uninvited joy. A plastic toy floated forlornly near the steps. The phrase, "community," pool echoed in her mind, a mocking refrain. Karen and Kevin didn't just want to borrow, they wanted to claim. They wanted to erase her ownership, her right to privacy, her very presence. Ilara walked to the edge of the pool, her hand trembling as she touched the cool, tiled rim. Her heart ached with a profound sense of violation. This wasn't just about a pool. It was about respect, about boundaries, about her right to exist in her own home without constant intrusion. Every previous attempt at civility, every polite request, every measured conversation had been met with dismissal and further encroachment. There was no reasoning with Karen. There was no appealing to a sense of neighborly decorum that simply didn't exist for her. She looked from the drain valve groaned, a metallic protest against the sudden forced release of hundreds of gallons of water. Ilara felt a strange mix of terror and exhilaration as the pool's surface, once a serene mirror, now swirled with a furious, growing vortex. The blue began to recede, exposing the dark, tiled bottom. Each inch of diminishing water felt like a physical weight lifting from her own shoulders. This wasn't just water. It was the embodiment of her years of suppressed frustration, her trampled boundaries, her shattered peace. Next door, Karen's party throbbed on, oblivious. The bass line from some generic pop song vibrated through the fence, a mocking counterpoint to the quiet, determined gurgle of the emptying pool. Ilara stood, wrench still clutched in her hand, watching the water level drop. It was a surprisingly slow process, agonizingly so, yet each passing minute brought a grim satisfaction. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across her now deserted yard. The muddy footprints of Kevin's friends, once a fresh insult, now seemed like a prophecy of the landscape to come. As the water level dropped below the first step, a small, brightly colored plastic shark, undoubtedly a casualty of Kevin's pool party, became marooned. Ilara kicked it gently with her foot. It rolled listlessly on the exposed tile. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about reclaiming her space, her sanity, her very right to say no. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to an hour. The water had significantly lowered, exposing the shallow end completely. The deeper end still held a considerable volume, but the transformation was undeniable. It was no longer an inviting, sparkling oasis. It was a draining, desolate pit. Ilara, exhausted but resolute, tightened the valve one last time, ensuring it was fully open. She wiped the sweat from her brow, her gaze fixed on the receding water, imagining the moment Karen and Kevin would discover her act of rebellion. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, a thrill, not fear. She went back inside, leaving the pool to its slow, deliberate death. The quiet inside her house was profound, a stark contrast to the distant party next door. Ilara made herself a cup of tea, her hands still faintly trembling, and sat by the window overlooking her backyard. The sight was surreal. Her beautiful blue pool was now half empty, a gaping maw in the earth, reflecting the dying light of the day like a bruised. It wasn't long before the thumping music next door suddenly, dramatically, cut out. The abrupt silence was jarring. Ilara leaned forward, a prickle of anticipation running through her. Had they noticed? Was it still too early? Then, a faint, high-pitched shriek pierced the air. Not a playful shriek, but one laced with disbelief, then fury. "Kevin! Mom! Mom, the pool! It's empty!" Ilara felt a grim smile tug at the corners of her lips. The sound of running feet followed, heavy and frantic. Karen's voice, usually syrupy sweet or dismissively calm, was now shrill, edged with panic. "What? Kevin, what are you talking about?" A moment later, through the gap in the fence, Ilara saw Karen's head, then her entire body appear. Her face was a mask of utter horror. Her eyes, wide and disbelieving, swept across Ilara's yard, from the now dry, shallow end to the steadily diminishing water in the deep. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish out of water. Kevin stood beside her, pointing a furious finger at Ilara's house. "She did it! Ilara did it! She drained my pool!" Karen whirled around, her gaze locking onto Ilara's window. Their eyes met, and in that instant, all pretense, all forced pleasantries evaporated. Karen's face contorted, her carefully constructed facade of blissful ignorance crumbling to reveal a raw, ugly rage. Ilara didn't flinch. She simply stared back, her expression unreadable. "Ilara, what the hell have you done?" Karen screamed, her voice echoing across the silent neighborhood. The party guests, a small cluster of bewildered adults and suddenly subdued children, now gathered at the fence, staring in stunned silence. Ilara slowly rose from her chair, walked to her back door, and opened it. She stepped onto her patio, hands calmly crossed over her chest. "I drained my pool, Karen," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the stunned silence like a knife. "It's my property. I can do with it as I please." "Your property?" Karen shrieked, her face turning a dangerous shade of red. She took a step towards the fence, her hands gripping the top plank as if she wanted to tear it down. You drained it? Why would you do such a thing? It's a heat wave. The children wanted to swim. Kevin wanted to have his party." "Kevin invited them to his pool," Ilara replied, a hint of steel in her tone. "This, as you can clearly see, is no longer a pool. Therefore, there is nothing for Kevin or his friends to swim in. Problem solved." "Problem solved?" Karen was practically spitting the words. "You think this is a solution? You've ruined everything. My party. The kids are devastated. Kevin is in tears." Kevin, true to his mother's word, had begun to wail, a loud, theatrical sob that he clearly hoped would elicit sympathy and condemnation for Ilara. "Perhaps next time," Ilara said, ignoring Kevin's dramatics. "Kevin will learn not to trespass on private property, and perhaps you, Karen, will learn to respect boundaries. This is my backyard. This is my pool. Or rather, it was." She gestured pointedly at the rapidly emptying basin. Karen was speechless, her mouth agape. The party guests exchanged uneasy glances. The silent judgment in their eyes was palpable. Ilara felt a wave of satisfaction. For years, Karen had skillfully manipulated public opinion, portraying Ilara as the sensitive or dramatic neighbor. Now, the stark reality of her entitlement was laid bare for everyone to see. "You are going to refill that pool, Ilara," Karen finally managed, her voice low and menacing, "and you are going to pay for every single drop of water and every single cent of damage you have caused." "Damage?" Ilara scoffed, a humorless laugh, escaping her lips. "The only damage done was to my peace, Karen. Damage done by your son and by your blatant disregard for my property. And no, I will not be refilling anything. This pool is closed indefinitely. Consider it a change of landscape. "This is an act of war!" Karen screamed, her composure completely gone. Her hands flew into the air, gesticulating wildly. You just wait until my husband hears about this. You'll regret this, Alara. I swear you will." Alara simply raised an eyebrow. "I regret nothing, Karen. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a very dry pool to contemplate, and perhaps a very quiet evening to enjoy." She turned to go back inside, but Karen's next words stopped her cold. "You're a menace, Alara. A sad, lonely woman with nothing better to do than ruin everyone else's fun. And for what? A little splashing? Some kids having a good time? You're pathetic." The words stung, aimed with malicious precision. Alara paused, her back to Karen. The familiar sting of old insecurities, of past rejections, flared for a moment. But then, she took a deep breath. She wasn't that woman anymore. She was the woman who had finally, decisively drawn a line in the sand, or rather, drained a line in the water. She turned back slowly, meeting Karen's enraged gaze with a calm, almost serene expression. "You know, Karen," Alara said, her voice soft but carrying a steel edge, "I used to think that. I used to think I was the problem. Too sensitive, too demanding, too much. But watching your son claim my property, watching you enable his entitlement, watching you stand there and demand I tolerate it, I realized something." She paused, letting the silence hang heavy between them. The other neighbors were now completely captivated, their murmurs silenced, their eyes darting between the two women. "I realized," Alara continued, her voice gaining strength, "that my peace, my boundaries, my home, they are not a fuss. They are not being dramatic. They are mine. And I am done apologizing for them. So no, Karen, I won't be refilling the pool. And no, I don't regret it. Not one bit." She gave Karen a small, tight smile that held no warmth. "Have a lovely rest of your evening." And with that, Alara turned, walked back into her house, and quietly closed the door, leaving Karen fuming, Kevin still wailing, and a small crowd of neighbors utterly stunned by the sudden, dramatic, and utterly decisive act of defiance. Only sound left was the distant, relentless gurgle of water as Alara's pool continued its descent into dryness. The party next door was well and truly over, and the real conflict, Alara knew, had only just begun. The silence inside Alara's house was a balm, a stark contrast to the storm she had just unleashed outside. She leaned against the closed door, her heart still thrumming with adrenaline, her hands still faintly tingling from the force of her words. The air outside had crackled with Karen's fury, but inside, a profound calm settled over Alara. For years, she had felt a persistent ache, a dull throb of resentment and powerlessness. Now, that ache was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness, where the pool water once was, and a surprising lightness in her chest. She walked back to the living room window, pulling the curtains aside just enough to peer out. The backyard was a spectral landscape in the fading twilight. The pool, now little more than a vast, sunken cavity, was nearly empty, a dark, gleaming expanse of wet tiles and exposed rebar. A few puddles lingered in the deep end, catching the last vestiges of daylight, reflecting a bruised, angry sky. The plastic shark lay abandoned, a tiny, poignant symbol of the day's vanquished chaos. Next door, the party lights flickered back on, but the music remained off. Alara could see the shadowy figures of Karen and her husband, Mark, gathered at the fence, staring at her property. Mark, a burly man with a perpetually stern expression, usually kept to himself, a silent, brooding presence behind Karen's effervescent chaos. But now, even from this distance, Alara could feel the intensity of his gaze, a palpable anger radiating from him. He was gesticulating, his arms sweeping dramatically towards her empty pool, then pointing towards her house. Karen was nodding emphatically, clearly recounting her version of events with dramatic embellishment. Alara knew the call to Mark was inevitable. Karen always ran to him when her own manipulations failed. He was her immovable object, her final line of defense, usually deployed to intimidate any perceived challenger. Alara braced herself. The actual act of draining the pool had been an impulsive, visceral reaction. Now came the calculated counterattack. She spent a fitful night. The absence of the usual nocturnal hum of the pool's filter was eerily noticeable. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside seemed amplified, imbued with a sense of impending doom. She kept replaying the confrontation with Karen, the look of disbelief on her face, the raw fury. And then, Karen's parting words. "This is an act of war." Alara knew she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. But she also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had no other choice. Her peace was worth fighting for. The next morning, the doorbell rang. Not a timid ring, but a prolonged, aggressive press that vibrated through the entire house. Alara took a deep breath, smoothing down her hair. It was early, barely past 8. She already knew who it was. She opened the door. Mark stood on her porch, Karen hovering belligerently behind him. Mark's face was set, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with a controlled rage that was far more unnerving than Karen's histrionics. Karen, for once, was silent, allowing her husband to take center stage, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. "Alara," Mark began, his voice low and gravelly, "we need to talk about your actions." He paused, letting the word hang heavy in the air. "Draining your pool, without warning, causing a significant amount of damage and distress." "Damage and distress to whom, Mark?" Alara asked, her voice calm. "To children who were trespassing on my property, invited by your son who falsely claimed my pool was his? Or to your wife, who openly encouraged their behavior?" Mark's eyes narrowed. "Trespassing is a strong word, Alara. Children often wander. Kevin was excited. He simply got carried away." "He unlocked my private gate, Mark," Alara countered, her voice unwavering. "He ran across my lawn with a dozen other children, cannonballed into my pool, and drenched my plants. And when I asked them to leave, he refused, claiming it was his pool, with Karen's full endorsement." She gestured towards Karen, who glared back defiantly. Mark shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the details, but determined to maintain his position. "Regardless of the circumstances, Alara, your reaction was extreme. You have caused considerable financial damage. We had to cancel Kevin's birthday party today, and all his friends are upset. Karen spent days planning that party." "Kevin's birthday party was supposed to be in your pool, Mark, in your backyard, not mine," Alara stated, a hint of weariness in her tone. "I'm sorry his party was canceled, but the blame for that lies with Karen and Kevin, not with me. My pool is my private property. I have every right to drain it, fill it, or turn it into a giant planter as I see fit." "You did this out of spite," Karen interjected, unable to hold her tongue any longer. "Because you're a bitter, lonely woman who can't stand to see other people happy." "Karen, please," Mark muttered, shooting her a warning glance. He turned back to Alara, his voice a little softer but still firm. "Look, Alara, we don't want this to escalate, but we are prepared to take legal action. This constitutes an intentional act of property damage and potentially emotional distress. We want you to refill the pool immediately, and we want you to pay for the wasted water and for any cleaning or maintenance costs associated with this incident." Alara stared at him, then at Karen, whose triumphant smirk had returned. Legal action. She knew this was coming. It was the Karen playbook. When she couldn't bully, she threatened. "Mark," Alara said, her voice dropping to a low, serious tone, "let me be perfectly clear. I will not be refilling the pool. I will not be paying for any wasted water. It's my water to waste. And as for property damage, my property was damaged first, by your son and his friends, with your wife's encouragement. If you wish to pursue legal action, you are free to do so. However, I will be countersuing for trespass, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and the cost of repairing my landscaping. She met his gaze squarely. I also have photographs of the children in my pool and witnesses to Karen's verbal consent to their actions. She hadn't actually taken photos, but the bluff felt good. Mark's stoic expression wavered for the first time. He hadn't expected her to be so prepared, so resolute. He glanced at Karen, whose smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of bewildered frustration. Photographs? He repeated, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Yes, Mark, Ilara lied smoothly. And I assure you my lawyer is very familiar with neighborhood disputes involving blatant disregard for private property. Karen gasped. You have a lawyer? Ilara simply smiled. Everyone has a right to legal counsel, Karen, especially when their property rights are being so egregiously violated. Mark stood there for a long moment, weighing her words. He was a man who understood leverage, and Ilara had just introduced a significant amount of it. The threat of a countersuit, of documented evidence, seemed to throw him off balance. This is completely unnecessary, Ilara, he finally said, his voice losing some of its aggressive edge. We're neighbors. We should be able to resolve this amicably. Amicably? Ilara repeated, a dry laugh escaping her. Mark, for 5 years I've tried to resolve things amicably. I've made polite requests. I've offered compromises. Each time I was met with dismissal, disrespect, and further encroachment. Your wife even called me pathetic yesterday for daring to stand up for myself. Draining the pool was not my first choice, it was my last choice. And it was a choice I was forced to make because the amicable route had been thoroughly exhausted by your family. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Mark held up a hand, silencing her. He looked at Ilara, a new glint in his eyes, not of anger, but of grudging respect, or perhaps a dawning realization that he had severely underestimated his quiet neighbor. He turned to Karen, his jaw still tight, but his gaze holding a subtle accusation. We'll discuss this further, he said, his voice flat. Karen looked utterly bewildered, her eyes darting between Ilara and her husband. The wind had been completely taken out of her sails. Mark then nodded curtly at Ilara. We'll be in touch, Ilara. He turned and walked away, Karen, for once, trailing silently behind him, her shoulders slumped, her triumphant smirk replaced by a look of utter defeat. Ilara watched them go, closing the door softly behind her. Her heart was still pounding, but it was no longer from fear. It was from the thrill of victory, small but significant. She had stared down Karen's enforcer, and she hadn't blinked. She hadn't backed down. The threat of legal action still hung in the air, a dark cloud, but for the first time, Ilara felt like she had an umbrella. She walked back to the window, pulling the curtains aside again. Mark and Karen were now standing in their own backyard, their heads bent together in what appeared to be a very heated discussion. Karen was gesticulating wildly, but Mark remained impassive, his back to Ilara, his stance radiating a frustrated authority. The other neighbors, who had undoubtedly been watching the entire exchange, were now retreating into their own houses, the curtain twitches and quickly averted gazes a testament to the juicy drama they had just witnessed. The sun was higher now, illuminating the bone-dry basin of her pool. It was an eyesore, a testament to a broken truce, a battle won at a considerable cost. But as Ilara looked at it, she didn't see ruin. She saw a canvas, empty and waiting, a space purged of unwanted intrusions, a testament to a boundary finally, irrevocably set. And for the first time in years, a profound sense of peace began to settle over her, a quiet, defiant calm that no amount of Karen's fury, The afternoon following Mark's strained visit was eerily quiet. The usual cacophony from next door was replaced by a tense, almost palpable silence. Ilara imagined Karen and Mark locked in a heated discussion, dissecting their options, strategizing, their next move. The neighborhood, too, seemed to hold its breath. Curtains twitched, quick glances were exchanged, and the usual sounds of children playing or lawnmowers buzzing were conspicuously absent. Ilara knew she had become the focal point of local gossip, a lightning rod for judgment, both silent and vocal. She ventured into her backyard, surveying the colossal empty pit that was once her cherished pool. The sun beat down, turning the exposed tiles into a blinding mosaic, and the faint smell of damp earth and stale chlorine clung to the air. It was a stark, almost brutal landscape, a testament to her defiance. For a fleeting moment, a pang of regret pierced her resolve. Her sanctuary was gone, replaced by this gaping maw, but then she remembered Kevin's smug face, Karen's dismissive wave, the utter disregard for her space. The regret receded, replaced by a steely satisfaction. As she walked along the edge, a small handwritten note caught her eye, tucked under a loose paver stone. Her heart gave a sudden thump. It wasn't a note from Karen. The handwriting was delicate, elegant. She unfolded it carefully. Dear Ilara, I saw what happened, and I just wanted to say thank you. My daughter Lily was one of the children Kevin invited. I found her sobbing on the phone to her friend afterwards, not because she couldn't swim, but because Kevin's mom said Ilara was mean and ugly and had ruined everything. Lily came home with muddy shoes and a story about how Kevin owned your pool and that she felt bad, but didn't know what to do. I've heard Karen complain about you for years, painting you as the villain, but watching her reaction yesterday and hearing your quiet firmness, I think I misjudged you. Completely. It took courage, Ilara. Thank you for showing Lily and perhaps the rest of us that some boundaries are worth defending. We're sorry for what you're going through. Sincerely, Sarah. Lily's mom, 2 houses down. Ilara's breath hitched. A wave of unexpected emotion washed over her, warm and reassuring. She hadn't expected validation, let alone gratitude. She had felt utterly alone in this battle, convinced that Karen's narrative had poisoned the entire neighborhood's perception of her. To know that someone had seen, had understood, offered a surprising sense of solidarity. It wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a stand against a pervasive entitlement that others had silently endured. The small note gave her strength. It reminded her why she had done it, not just for herself, but for the principle of it. She carefully folded the note and tucked it into her pocket. The empty pool no longer looked quite so desolate. The next morning, a subtle change occurred. A large, garish banner appeared on Karen's side of the fence, directly opposite Ilara's now dry pool. It was bright yellow, with bold red lettering. Support our kids! Neighborhood fund deserves to be shared! Below it, in smaller print, let's build a community fund for a real neighborhood pool. Ilara stared at it, a dry, humorless laugh escaping her lips. Karen's passive-aggressive masterpiece. She wasn't just trying to shame Ilara, she was trying to turn the neighborhood against her, framing herself as the benevolent community leader and Ilara as the selfish tyrant. The banner was a declaration, a public appeal for sympathy and funds, a cleverly disguised attack. It was a subtle, yet undeniably calculated escalation. Later that day, Ilara noticed a small group of people gathered in Karen's yard, ostensibly for a casual chat, but their eyes kept darting towards the banner and then to Ilara's empty pool. Karen naturally was at the center, animatedly talking, her hands clasped dramatically, her head shaking in what Ilara imagined was feigned sorrow. It was the beginning of her smear campaign. Ilara decided she wouldn't engage directly with the banner or with Karen's performance. She would respond in her own way. She went to her local hardware store, buying several large, hardy bags of wildflower seeds. That afternoon, under the watchful, curious eyes of Karen and her assembled audience, Ilara began to prepare her empty pool basin. She raked away the debris, chipped away at some of the stubborn algae, and then, with deliberate, almost ritualistic movements, began to scatter the wildflower seeds across the entire expanse of the former pool. The sight was utterly absurd, but Ilara felt a profound sense of purpose. A dry pool was an eyesore. A wildflower garden? That was transformation. That was beauty rising from the ashes of conflict. It was an act of creation in response to an act of destruction, her own destruction. As she worked, she heard Karen's voice rise, clear and sharp, from next door. "Look at her, tearing up her own yard. She really has gone mad. Just look at what she's doing to her property." Ilara ignored her, continuing her work. She imagined the vibrant blues, purples, and yellows that would soon burst forth from the barren ground. She pictured butterflies and bees, a thriving ecosystem where only stagnant water and entitlement once reigned. This wasn't just a garden, it was a symbol of resilience, of reclaiming and repurposing. A few days later, a second note appeared under her paver. This time, it was from an elderly couple, the Millers, who lived directly across the street. "Dear Ilara, we wanted to let you know that we see what you're doing. The wildflowers are a beautiful idea. We've had our own difficulties with Karen over the years. Never anything so grand, mind you, but little things. The hedges she trimmed too far back, the noise at all hours, the way she talks over everyone. It takes a brave soul to stand up to her. Don't let her get to you. We support your decision. Good luck with the garden. Sincerely, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, another ally." Ilara felt a surge of quiet strength. Her isolated act of defiance was slowly, subtly becoming something more. The neighborhood wasn't a monolithic entity swayed solely by Karen's manipulation. There were others who saw, who understood, who had their own grievances. The days turned into a week. Karen's banner remained, a constant, garish reminder. She continued her subtle campaign, engaging neighbors in hushed conversations, hosting small, impromptu gatherings on her lawn, always positioned so the banner was visible and the empty pool a stark backdrop. Ilara, in turn, continued her work on the garden. She brought in bags of topsoil, carefully spreading them over the seed-strewn basin. She was transforming the wound into something beautiful, an act of defiant creativity. Then the legal letter arrived. It was official, formal, and utterly devoid of the personal vitriol Ilara had come to expect from Karen. It was from a law firm, demanding that Ilara immediately refill her pool, restore it to its previous condition, and reimburse the plaintiffs, Karen and Mark Henderson, for damages incurred, including but not limited to wasted water, loss of enjoyment of property, and emotional distress. The letter outlined a clear threat of legal action if she did not comply within 14 days. Ilara read the letter calmly, her earlier bluff about a lawyer now feeling like a stroke of genius. She wasn't entirely surprised. This was Karen's escalation, moving from public shaming to legal intimidation. But Ilara was no longer the timid woman who retreated from conflict. She was the woman who had drained a pool. She picked up the phone, her fingers steady as she dialed the number of the one lawyer she knew, a distant cousin named David who specialized in property disputes. It had been years since they spoke, but Ilara knew he was good, sharp, and had a reputation for not backing down. "David? It's Ilara," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I need your help. It seems my neighbors and I are having a bit of a disagreement about a pool." The conversation with David was reassuring. He listened patiently, taking notes, asking pointed questions. He confirmed that Ilara had a strong case against trespass and nuisance, especially given Karen's clear enablement of the children. He also warned her that Karen and Mark likely had a case for intentional infliction of emotional distress on their side, a common tactic in neighborhood disputes, though often difficult to prove without severe, documented harm. David explained the process, the potential costs, and the likely long, drawn-out nature of such a conflict. "Ilara," David concluded, his voice serious, "this won't be easy. Karen and Mark are clearly determined. They'll try to wear you down. But you have rights, and it sounds like you're finally ready to defend them." "I am, David," Ilara said, looking out at her emerging wildflower garden. The tiny green shoots were just beginning to appear, pushing through the dark soil, reaching for the sun, a metaphor, she thought, for herself. "I'm more than ready." The game was on. The legal battle was the new arena, replacing the disputed pool. Ilara felt a fresh surge of resolve. The banner next door, the legal threat, they were just more fuel for her fire. She had found her voice, she had found her courage, and she was no longer alone. Karen might have escalated the war, but Ilara was ready to fight it. And she had a feeling, deep down, that justice, much like her wildflowers, would eventually bloom. The legal gears began to grind with a slow, deliberate hum. David, Ilara's cousin and now her attorney, was as good as his reputation suggested. He immediately responded to the Hendersons' legal letter, not with aggression, but with a firm, meticulously detailed counterclaim. He cited the numerous instances of trespass, the verbal harassment, the intentional infliction of emotional distress, and included the dates Ilara had documented her attempts to resolve the issues amicably. He also subtly alluded to the notes of support Ilara had received from other neighbors, framing them as potential witnesses to Karen's disruptive behavior and Ilara's prior attempts at peaceful resolution. The first volley was a request for mediation. David advised Ilara that this was standard procedure, a way for both parties to attempt to resolve the dispute outside of court. Ilara, despite her reservations about sitting in a room with Karen again, agreed. She was ready to face her, but, this time, with legal representation and a clear, unwavering stance. While the legal machinations unfolded, Karen's public relations campaign intensified. The garish yellow banner became a permanent fixture on her fence. She organized a community BBQ in her backyard, ostensibly to raise funds for a neighborhood pool, but clearly a thinly veiled attempt to rally support and badmouth Ilara. The air often carried the scent of grilled meat and the sound of Karen's booming laughter, followed by hushed, conspiratorial whispers. Ilara sometimes saw cars pulling up, neighbors she recognized, entering Karen's yard with plates of food. She knew she was the primary topic of conversation. Ilara found solace in her garden, the wildflower seeds, nurtured by a few days of rain, and the relentless summer sun were now truly flourishing. Tiny green shoots had transformed into a riot of color, a vibrant tapestry of blues, purples, reds, and yellows. Butterflies fluttered, bees buzzed, and the once desolate basin was now a thriving, buzzing ecosystem. It was beautiful, defiant, and deeply personal. It was her peace, manifest. One afternoon, as Ilara was kneeling, weeding around a particularly robust cluster of poppies, she heard a soft voice call her name. She looked up to see Sarah, Lily's mom, standing tentatively at her fence. Sarah had a plate covered with foil in her hands. "Ilara? I hope I'm not disturbing you," Sarah said, her voice gentle. I made some extra brownies and I thought you might appreciate a break." She extended the plate over the fence. Ilara smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. "Sarah, you're a lifesaver. Thank you." She took the plate, the warmth of the brownies a comforting contrast to the ongoing chill of her dispute with Karen. "Your garden is truly stunning," Sarah said, her eyes sweeping over the vibrant blooms. It's quite a statement. It is, Ilara agreed, her gaze meeting Sarah's. A statement that peace can grow in the most unlikely of places. Sarah nodded, a knowing look on her face. Lily talks about it all the time. She says it's much prettier than a boring old pool. She hesitated, then leaned in slightly. Karen, she's really been pushing the narrative about you being unreasonable, ruining community spirit. She even tried to get me to contribute to her pool fund. And did you? Ilara asked, a hint of curiosity in her voice. Sarah shook her head emphatically. Absolutely not. I told her that. Perhaps respecting other people's property was a good start for community spirit. She didn't like that very much. She chuckled softly. Mark, her husband, actually looked a little uncomfortable. It seems not everyone is as easily swayed as Karen thinks. That's good to hear, Ilara said, a weight lifting from her. Just thought you should know you're not alone, Sarah added, her smile warm. There are more of us than you think. She gave a small wave and walked away, leaving Ilara with a plate of brownies and a renewed sense of camaraderie. The mediation session was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, in a sterile conference room at a neutral legal office downtown. Ilara wore a crisp, tailored suit, feeling a strange blend of nervousness and steely resolve. David met her in the lobby, his presence a reassuring anchor. Karen and Mark arrived shortly after, Karen in a brightly patterned dress that seemed deliberately chosen to project an image of cheerful victimhood, Mark grim-faced and radiating suppressed anger. Their lawyer, a slick, self-assured man named Mr. Harrison, offered a curt nod to David but avoided Ilara's gaze entirely. The mediator, a placid woman with kind eyes and a firm demeanor, began by outlining the process. Each side would present their case, then engage in structured negotiation. Mr. Harrison opened for the Hendersons, his voice smooth and practiced. He painted a picture of a distraught family, their child's birthday party ruined, their property devalued by an intentional and malicious act of destruction by a vengeful neighbor. He emphasized the cost of refilling and maintaining the pool and the considerable emotional distress caused to Kevin and Karen, framing Ilara's actions as disproportionate and spiteful. He presented photographs of the empty pool, stark and barren, and a printout of Karen's Community Pool Fund banner, arguing it demonstrated their commitment to neighborhood harmony despite Ilara's antagonistic behavior. Then it was David's turn. He didn't raise his voice. He simply laid out the facts, calmly and methodically. He presented dates and times of previous attempts by Ilara to address noise and trespass. He recounted Kevin's brazen invasion, Karen's enabling, and her public declarations that Ilara's pool was his and a community pool. He meticulously detailed the legal definition of trespass and nuisance, contrasting it with Ilara's clear right to manage her own property. He even brought up Karen's public disparagement of Ilara. My client, David concluded, his voice resonating with quiet conviction, did not act out of malice, but out of desperation. After years of persistent encroachment on her property and her peace, and after her polite requests were not only ignored, but met with disdain, she exercised her right as a homeowner to control her own land. She drained her own pool. This was not property damage. It was property management. The true damages here, both financial and emotional, were inflicted upon Ms. Vance by the persistent disregard of the Hendersons. The room was silent. Karen, who had been fidgeting and occasionally muttering during David's presentation, now looked absolutely livid. Mark, however, was studying David, a thoughtful, almost troubled expression on his face. The mediator began to facilitate. Ms. Vance, the Hendersons are asking for the pool to be refilled and for reimbursement of the water costs, plus a sum for emotional distress. Are you willing to consider these terms? Ilara looked directly at Karen, then at Mark. No, she said. her voice firm. "I will not refill the pool. I will not pay for the water. The pool is now a wildflower garden, a project I've invested considerable time and resources into. It is a symbol of the peace I've finally reclaimed. I am, however, willing to drop my countersuit for trespass and emotional distress if the Hendersons agree to cease all further legal action, take down their banner, and ensure that Kevin and any future guests understand and respect the boundaries of my property." Karen gasped, outraged. "You want us to just drop everything after you ruined everything?" "You ruined everything, Karen," Alara corrected, her gaze steady. "I merely responded," Mr. Harrison intervened. "Ms. Vance, your proposal is entirely unreasonable. My clients have incurred significant costs and emotional suffering. They are entitled to restitution. And I," Alara countered, "am entitled to peace and privacy in my own home, something your clients have systematically denied me for years. My offer is a compromise. It means I absorb the cost of my pool's destruction and the time and expense of transforming it. It means I forego compensation for the trespass and harassment. It is, in fact, quite generous, given the circumstances." Mark, surprisingly, spoke up. "What about the community pool fund?" he asked, looking at Karen. "The banner?" Karen looked stunned by his question. "It's for the neighborhood, Mark, to bring everyone together." "Or to publicly shame our neighbor," Mark retorted, his voice sharper than Alara had ever heard him speak to Karen. "And to implicitly encourage others to contribute to our legal fees." "You also mentioned photographs, Alara?" he asked, turning to her, his eyes searching hers for a tell. Alara met his gaze, holding it. "I am prepared to provide all evidence to my attorney Mark," she said, carefully choosing her words. She saw a flicker of doubt, then resignation, cross his face. The session continued for another hour, a grueling back and forth. Karen remained obstinate, fueled by a sense of righteous indignation. Mr. Harrison tried various tactics, attempting to paint Alara as vindictive and unneighborly. But David held firm, calmly reiterating Alara's rights and the documented history of Karen's own transgressions. Finally, after another recess where the Hendersons argued loudly behind a closed door, the mediator returned, looking weary. "The Hendersons are unwilling to accept Ms. Vance's terms for dismissal," she stated. "They insist on the pool being refilled and damages paid. Therefore, this mediation has reached an impasse. The case will proceed to court." Alara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Court. The formal, intimidating arena she had hoped to avoid. But as she looked across the table at Karen, whose face was a mask of furious determination, and Mark, who looked deeply unhappy but resigned, Alara knew she had done all she could. She had offered a fair compromise, and it had been regia.